Ta'ala and welcome to the Reads with Rosa podcast. Today's guest is a storyteller and entrepreneur of Samoan and Niuean ancestry. He is also a music composer, vocalist, and a content creator with an emphasis on Tagata Moana cultural revival and preservation. He was the host and co-producer of Sounds of the Moana, a two-part podcast series that won the music category at the prestigious New York Festival Radio Awards. Most recently, you would have seen him on the docu-series Instruments of the Moana, which he wrote and co-directed. His family are key supporters of Tau'ili'ili Mamau Collective, Pacific Disabled Collective founded and based in Aotearoa. It is my honor to welcome to the show Tau'ili'ili Alpha Maiava. Woohoo! Welcome, Malolo Soikuela Fionga Tau'ili'ili.
Hello, my name is Ifua of Sumarosa. Greetings
Oh.
to all your fans around the world and to all of those who are big fans of your podcast. And thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm humbled. It's an honor to have you here. I should actually be saying welcome to all of your fans. I mean, we'll get into it, but yeah, everyone, Tau'ili'ili Alpha Maiava. Yeah, I mean, you know, I usually like to ask guests if they could, just shout out their villages and where they are from before we get started. So if you could do that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, one of the most challenging thing about us as Tagata Moana is we have a saying in Samoa, "Telia o Tagata nai loa o la'a." We humans in general have more plentiful roots than a tree does. So, but I'll just acknowledge the ones where I grew up in that were part of the initial. So, I was born in the village of Tau'ili'ili, where is my mother's maternal village, and I also between my time was between that and Utuali, which is also my father's maternal village. My Matai title Tau'ili'ili comes from Letongo, which is my mother's paternal village. And my other Matai title of Tau'ava comes from Safa'i and Savai, which is my father's paternal village. And then it just goes on and on. The villages of Avao. I am from Liatum Tautu, which is what they call that little slap of land, which includes Safa'i, Satolpai, Lelepa, Avao. You get the works. I also am connected to the village of Lepea. That is where my maternal grandmother on my father's side's father comes from. And so then, that's all stopped there. But also, I think most importantly is that I acknowledge Niue as an ancestral home for me. It is where my great grandfather, the late Vili Koka Patoa or Pahetoa, came from, and from the villages of Avasele and Hakupu in the early 1900s to Samoa during a time when there was quite a few lot of Niueans that did the migration to work, to find work in Samoa. And I'm just one of the descendants. There's so many of us Niuean Samoans that we've got a whole village named after us. In Samoa, they call it Ayo Niue, which is Niuean town, or we were the Chinatown before Chinatown was Chinatown. But this one here is the Niue town, and then also there's a village of Waipuna. So there's a lot of us that come from Samoa who whakapapa to Niue. My great grandfather was a bit of a smart cookie. He left all of that in town and came all the way to Kuatu Mofoali, where he met my great grandmother, and thus the story began. So I'm sorry for prolonging, but it's one of those things where to acknowledge who I am, I must acknowledge what I saw recently online. I must acknowledge the Kumara patch that is responsible for me being here.
My lord. I do want to talk about Sounds of the Moana. I want to get into Instruments of the Moana, which is the recent docu-series. But I need to know, like, what is your background in music? Like, where does your connection to the indigenous sounds and to the music and love for music and researching music, and where does that begin for you?
I think us as Pacific people, we are quite rhythmic in general. We are quite spiritual in general. So when Christianity arrived, and then we later adopted the choral and hymenic singing, we took to it like a duck in the water. We it's natural to us. I think indigenous peoples in general, we are really good with music. So, like anyone else, and my apologies if you can hear my daughter running around in the background. Um, I grew up in church, right? I grew up in Samoa under the guidance of my late grandmother who raised me, Tau'ili'ili whereby church was everything. So that's kind of where, I mean, that's the only memory that I have. I grew up in a singing house, but they weren't singers. We were just people who adhere to part of the Christian faith, and that's where the singing is. And then also youth groups and cultural performances. But for me, I've always had a love for, I guess I was quite inquisitive in the sense whereby I've always asked questions. For instance, my house in Samoa was right next to the Mormon church, but we grew up in Loka'iki, which is it's about 30 minutes walk on the other side of the village. And holler out to my Mormons, but I always wondered why they look like foreigners. They always wear a suit and tie and the creamy cut haircut and long pants. I've always wanted to know, why do we dress like that? As a matter of fact, why do Christians in Samoa in general have to wear white and wear the colonial hat that came with the missionary's wife who came to Samoa? So that's the kind of nature that fostered me. And then also with a grandmother who was a Matai, one of the only female tanuvasa in my village, and she would take me everywhere. So I grew up behind her, sitting in the Tau'ili'ili, just you know, trying to be a 2, a 3, a 4, or 5-year-old playing with little rocks. And so, what has happened through that time is there was a lot of deposits of culture. Without me knowing, I'm listening to Laungo, Folosanga, and the art of oratory in Samoa was a part of me. So that played a big role as I grew up and became a musician, I guess, where I began with singing and then fatungo, laningo pese, or composition in general. And then, yeah, so all of these things. And the more I found myself loving my culture, and because obviously growing up, we were a family that was very deep in culture. And so as they came together as I got older, I realized that my old younger self, the one that's always asking a million questions that I got a lot of tough love for, don't want to say Heidi because then people will be like, what kind of trauma did he have? Um, Tough love started to make sense in terms of what has now shaped my current life.
Mm. So then how did you get involved with sounds, with, Centre for New Zealand Music, and I guess with instruments of the Moana, this revitalization project? Like, how did you get connected with them? Like, what works were you doing before, and then did they like reach out to you and say, "Hey, let's collaborate and network," or did you approach them with the idea?
So for me, culturally, I've always been someone who walks in both worlds very strong. My Samoa, just my Moana-ness. Um, I grew up traveling the Moana. My father was Samoa's first full-blooded pilot back in the early 1970s. Now, I'm digressing a little bit, but I'm getting to your answer. My father came to New Zealand to study to be an aeronautical engineer in the 70s. But when he went back to Samoa, a lot of these kinds of jobs, like because most of us who Samoans were either expected to be teachers or nurses or the ones that we can teach the natives to do. And so my father kind of broke the mold and wanted to be an aeronautical engineer, but those roles were filled by Afakasi, and also expats. We had quite a large expat community in Samoa. My father went back to Samoa, and even though he had a higher qualification than the Palangi that was the head of the hangar, they put him in a septic tank team. Now, the septic
Mm.
tank, for most of our audience, back in those days when a plane lands, you have humans to physically remove the septic tank from the plane, filled with all the whatever meal you had prior, during, or before you got on the plane. And then you have to go take and dump it at the back of coconut trees for Satapuala, right? And so my father thought, well, this is not what I went to school for. And I went back to New Zealand to become a pilot. 1975, my father came to Samoa as a pilot, but they wouldn't hire him because at that time it was only Afghanis and expats. So my father then went across to American Samoa, where there was a company called SPIA, South Pacific International Airways, owned by a Palangi couple. They saw my father's qualification on his first day. They hired him as a captain.
Mm.
Not the color of the skin, as per Captain Martin Luther King, but the content of the character and the achievement. Funny enough, they had an inaugural celebration of the first flight of SPIA from Pango Pango, American Samoa, to Faleolo. And guess who the pilot jumped out? Bob Marley in the Bible says, the stone that the builder refused will always be the right cornerstone. That's the house that raised me. Village people, Savai'i people. We broke mold early. All right. So that's how culture got into me. I spent nearly 10 years in the Middle East, in Asia, just learning about cultures. I've always loved cultures. I love their sounds. I love the history of things. I've always wondered, hey, who was responsible for the violin? Because we were taught through westernized view of our culture. And so I came back to New Zealand, to Aotearoa, and I had a friend named Tiumalu no Masio, and very well known in the arts. And 30 years experience have been with the Auckland Philharmonic Orchestra, um, great 37 hertz. And so we caught up, and she was like, brother, I've just joined Sounds Center for New Zealand Music as the first, I believe she was the first Tagata Moana board member. And you got to understand, this is an organization that was founded in 1991 to sort of serve as um, our own classical musicians and jazz.
Mm.
And later on, they took on Te Reo Maori or Maori Puoro Maori, which is great. They should have been part of the first thing because this is Aotearoa. And then they expanded to include Tagata Moana compositions. And so, but they needed to come together somehow to figure out, you know, what does sound want from our tangata,
Mm.
and how do we make sure that we protect whatever that they're willing to extract from us. And so we came together, and I hosted their first ever. I facilitated a strategy meeting. So the whole came, and we had all of the elders from as many of the Moana that reside in Aotearoa come together, and through that we recognized that Sounds wants to expand into um, to what you call it, to bringing on composers, not just those specific people who study music in the Palangi
Mm.
classical way, but also our traditional composers, right? Because our composition traditionally is just as important. So anyway, we got together, and part of the agreement we have a saying in Samoa, or the tamal fofuanga, or the tamal maftanga. It's almost like a marriage. Now you must produce
Mm.
something to signify you coming together. That's how we got onto the podcast.
Mhm.
So they needed, they were like, Tau'ili'ili, what is something that we can do? We've never done this before. And so I thought about a podcast whereby we focus in on instruments. But then the Pacific is so big. We are 50 plus islands. We are over 1,000 dialects, 1,000 languages with over 2,000 dialects. Where do you start? So I decided to focus in on instruments that we have similar. So I thought, okay, let's just have a look. And out of that thinking, um, conch, the conch or the 4/4 or the poo in different languages is one. No matter where you go in the Pacific, you'll always find one. We use it differently. We use it ceremonially. The Tahitian and the Cook Islands use it performance. Puoro Maori use the same. So it's a great conch. What's the next one? So we looked at the nose flute.
Mm.
It was particularly quite famous for our Asiatic region of the world. And then the third one was the lali, the drums. And then, got the instrument. Now I needed to dive into what were their origin stories. I didn't care about the
Mm.
ones that were written by ethnomusicologists who have developed to become doctors of our music based on their research in the 50s and the 40s. I needed to focus in on origin narrative. Someone said to me, well, you have to be careful. It has to be academically proved. I said, well, that's another form of colonialism, isn't it?
Mm.
It's my art. And yet I come to your book to figure out how real what I'm saying. And so I used a lot of Matai Samoa, um, some Tongan academic who were in the know, also a lot of our traditional leaders from the Cook Islands, and went about it, and then produced the podcast that became the gold medal winner. And it was
Yeah.
funny because we ended up beating BBC, CNN,
Mm.
BBC 1, 2, and 3, I think. And those organizations had budgets of like 500,000. We had a budget of like 10,000 New Zealand dollars.
Wow.
So
Yeah,
obviously,
congrats.
the podcast went on to do what it did.
Mm.
Um, so yeah,
It's out there in the world. I mean, congratulations. So it was you won a gold award at the prestigious New York Festival Radio Awards. Um, yeah, amazing. I remember hearing about it. I was like, what? Like, that's a bit of us, the collective, our people, our stories, our history out there. It's a start. I mean, when people have asked you, what do the sounds of Moana Nui a Kiwa sound like, or what do our indigenous sounds like sounds? What do they sound like? What do you say to them? Because with 50 plus islands, like where do you begin to explain that to people who want to know more? Do you just say go research, go listen to the podcast?
yeah, it's everything that you just mentioned. Look, I always tell people, here's the reality. You look at the rainbow, look at the
Mm,
royalty biv, or what we've been called to describe the colors of the rainbow. As many as there are colors of the rainbow and the in betweens of your primary colors, languages and sounds of the Moana outnumbers all of that. And it wasn't a claim of boasting. I mean, look at Africa in general. You
mm,
look at the indigenous languages and the sounds of Africa, it outnumbers the colors of the rainbow. You look at what is now known as the Americas, their indigenous sounds, it outnumbers. And that's why I always tell people we added to the tropical rainbow of the world sounds. And then it follows that. So I'll give them examples in terms of, you know, you've heard of the conch, sometimes I have to, depending on who's asking me, I'll use things like the movie Moana. If it's, the Mama movie that blowing the conch, yeah, that's one of them. But if it's one of our own people who is asking based on their own identity walk, I'll give them a little bit more information, and then I'll say, here's the thing, I'm not the expert of this. I'm only someone who was lucky to gather these little information in the hope that you go and you explore further, because the deeper you go into knowing these instruments, you're actually digging deeper into an identity understanding of your own that you probably was never part of your cultural practice inside your house because of some one way or another. So it depends on who's asking, but I always try to explain to people it's quite a lot.
mm,
Podcast only gathered three because that was the only three the organization of sounds had money for.
mm. Money, yeah, need money, right, to do the work. So then, instruments of the Moana, which we've got, a short series of clips, and you're talking to these knowledge holders, I guess, in their islands. Like, how long? What was the time frame that you were given to do the research, to record, to speak to them? Uh, yeah.
Sorry. So, Instruments of the Moana was funny. It came out of two things. It came out of people's response to the podcast, right?
Mm,
The Sounds of the Moana. Because when I first, when I started making the national news here in Aotearoa, all our community were putting me on their radios and on their shows
you were
in the
everywhere.
languages. Yeah, right. But everybody would ask me the same thing. Hey, oh God, Mangaya, where can we see it?
Mm,
Yeah. So no matter, I then for the Samoans, I try to explain. For those of you who came from Samoa, I'm sure you've seen, you are familiar with the program Palolo Mua. I don't know if you know this, Rosa, but when I grew up in Samoa, we didn't have TV. Yeah, everything was radio based, and 8 o'clock every night during school nights and Saturdays, funnily enough, right after the Inuusi annunciation of money being sent from New Zealand to Samoa.
Right.
You always know when the program is because they always answer with the same man. O tala tupe nei mo o to tupe ta mai New Zealand mo le fiu anga o me to sela tala. And so right after that, Palolo Mua. And Palolo Mua was pretty much an early form of podcast. It was run by a very well-known Samoan journalist, and I feel like Apululan Spolu, who owns a very well-known media outlet in Samoa. But he would tell stories of mythologies from around the world. And 8 o'clock, I used to listen, and it always ile tai au le sto na I na va ai ai se te malo so my ears just kind of that was the only form of dreaming that we had because we didn't have TV. It was purely radio. And so that plus the talatu'u of the youth of our village, the tula fale about. So my memory got really massive really early. And all I had to do was listen to the radio and then imagine 95% of whatever Lance was saying. I'm sure half of the stuff in my head had nothing to do with the story, but when that's all you know at the time. And so for me, that's kind of how this began. So when I came to New Zealand, I came someone who grew up in Palolomo. And so when I met our old people, I expected them to remember Palolomo. But I was quickly reminded that even though elders now live technology, and people just do the same thing. They always ask me, hey, where can we watch it? So an opportunity came up whereby the previous CE of Sounds, my dear friend Diana Marsh, said to me, Alpha, if is there anything left in the tank? I was like, well, yeah, but it's a bit of a stupid idea. It's like, okay, I'm ready for stupid ideas because we kind of have nothing at the moment. I said, okay, but if we have the money, I will take a film crew and I will I'll go to every single island and say, what for? I want to expand the podcast into a film. But I wanna show the making of the instrument. And I had 4 questions. What is the instrument? Was there a person or group or individual or entity that was responsible for the foundation of the instrument? What did they use it for other than it being a musical instrument? And then where is it today and why? And so we went looking for funds, and we had to approach the Ministry of Culture and Heritage of the government of New Zealand as they were producing funds at the time. And so, one day Diana said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." Said, "Stupid idea came through." So, like
Wow.
what? Yeah, stupid idea came through. Okay, I get. So when do we get? When do we begin? So we began filming in September, and we started traveling around the Pacific. There were islands on our list that unfortunately we didn't get to go to. But look, I'm happy with the 7 that we did end up traveling to, and we didn't finish until March 2024 in terms of the filming. And then this kind of work, it coincides with filming, research in terms of what exists prior, and then we also go into the sound, the music, the everything else that I didn't sign up for. I thought I'm a villager, yeah, point the camera and action, and after that, cut, yeah, release. Unfortunately, that's not how it went, but that's how the instruments of the Moana came. And when that happened, the same question. So, what are you going to do? I said, well, let me look at instruments that I needed to do a balance between the ones that are already extinct, where the only records exist either in books or in a museum somewhere, and then the ones that are pretty much almost on its way to the extinction basket. So that's how we came up with 8.
I was wondering, just in your travels and doing the research about some of these instruments, did you come across stories of, well, these instruments exist, they're just in a museum somewhere across the world, or they're in a museum in New Zealand or Australia? Do you know what I mean? Or were they just disappeared, they were on island and now there's no sign of it whatsoever?
Combination of both, depending on the island that you go to. Um, And I think for the audience listening, I always say this: don't hear what I'm not saying.
Mm,
But a lot of the influence on how we got to lose a lot of these instruments were the early Christian missionaries.
mm,
And I say this because you have to understand a lot of the missionaries that did venture out into these indigenous lands, the lands of the savage,
mm,
were ignorant white people who their society is based on the hierarchy of Europe at that time, the have and the have nots. Yeah. And a lot of them have great hearts. But remember, they came to our shores through the lens of the environment that raised them. So anything that fell or fallen outside of the perception of what their normality was considered either a hinder
mm,
or just not part of the faith that we're trying to bless you with. So I'll start an example in terms of just give you like, and a lot of them too were unintentional,
mm,
but quite a few were purposely done so. So in the podcast, I talk about a chap named Reverend William Woon who came from Cornwall in England. Um, I always laugh when it comes to this stuff because funniest thing is these papalangis didn't think that one day these dumb natives will grow up and understand everything they wrote about us. Right? Because I think if they knew that one day we would grow up to understand what they wrote about us, they probably would have written about us in a little bit more nicer way.
mm,
Not so much the ignorant savage, or you know. So anyway, this chap went to Tonga, and Tonga have always had a kind of singing that was uniquely Pacific. I guess for Samoans, there's a leftover that's called Fa'asala. It's
mm,
a tone that plays outside of the realm of singing. Um, I guess that's the original form of freestyle singing, where you come and touch base, and then you know. So he went to Tonga, and of course, all Christians was the key to the piano, the major chords, the choral, the hymns. But every time he would play it to the Tongans would sing it back in how they interpret music. Right, so it doesn't matter whether you give me a C, they will sing it back to you in pentatonic tone. And so he
mm,
wrote it down in his diary. These Tongans are absolutely tone deaf. That no matter what major chords I give it to them, they can only sing it back in these minor chords. And then he wrote a plan. He suggested to the church, we must do with a plan to make sure that they will one day do away with it. Absolutely succeeded. If you do the Afofakafa Aikehe to Tongans today, they will tell you that you are smoking some kind of crack, and that's got nothing to do with Tonga.
mm,
All right. But there was nothing devilish. It was just the way they consume and output sound. Yeah. That same view was then put across anything to do with our faith when they arrived. Whatever spirituality we had at the time, it was accompanied by instruments. So to delete, fully smash the faith, you must also set aside the things that, in
mm,
their eyes, assisted in the maintenance of these beliefs. That and technology.
mm,
Even in the early 1700s, imagine this: you and I have ancestors who, in the 1700s, were using stone axe, and it probably took us 2 weeks to cut down a tree, and then a beachcomber or palangi trading came and gave you a saw, demonstrated to you. Voila! You saw a saw that could cut a tree down in a day that requires you to cut down 2 weeks with your old school axe. So what do you do? Well, look at us today. We used to go to the library and turn pages of encyclopedia. What do
mm,
we do today? We Google it. So think about the same technological, that happened with us. Yeah. So imagine the sounds that came. And in the case of Samoa, when John Williams converted the Malieto, and back in those days, Samoa had a level of ali'is that we no longer have. They call them ali'i pa'ia and ali'i sili. They were almost oracle priests within the belief system that Samoa had. Well, ali'i pa'ia and ali'i sili, when they tell you to do something, not like these days where we have negotiable.
mm,
Well, I duly respect your opinion, but I think it's just not possible. Not in those days. And so when John Williams converted Williamu, Malietoa, the word went down. This is now the faith of us to go on forward. All of those other stuff that you guys, the hoogly boogly stuff you used to do at night and Po'ula and all of that must now do away, or else you'll be angering the Alisili. And so
Mm.
generations of it began to come down. That too also played a part just as much as technology. When we heard the piano, when we heard the kikala, when
Mm.
we heard the ukulele, oh, the sweetest sound. And so technologically, we, without, just like the elders that I'm facing of why I ended up doing the instruments, here I am
Mm.
thinking, yeah, they're my crowd because they're used to Palolo Mua. Little did I know, even though they're in their 80s, they moved on to watching instead of listening. So the same technological challenge encountered by our people also contributed to our instruments dying out. So
Mm.
Sam, we lost our nose flute, we lost our panpipe. We also used to have panpipes. Our stamping tube, whereas Tonga still used the stamping tube, PG to a certain degree. Panpipe is alive and well in the Solomons. The Lali and the Pate are alive and well in Cook Island in Tahiti. And a lot of the sounds that exist in Aotearoa by Maori um, came from a revival that began 30 years ago. So, to some degree, uh, various different islands is the variation of how much we've lost.
Mm. You know the contributors to the series. Were you meeting them for the first time, or had you kind of connected with them in other spaces prior to the recording?
Absolutely first time.
Oh, I was just wondering
Absolutely.
about the wealth of knowledge that was shared in
Yeah.
those moments, like that the recording that we didn't see on film. I mean, amazing. It must have been really, yeah.
It was, you have to understand, I don't know, but somebody said that I'm actually the first Pacific Islander. This is the first documentary that is fully
Mm.
narrated by a fob about our people. You always see documentaries about us by an Australian.
Yeah, Balangi people.
It's where the leaf fall down in Samoa and then right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when I approach it, I would get in touch with the governments of these islands. But of course, when I said I'm coming in to find instruments, they're like, huh? Why? What for?
Mm.
you know?
Mm.
So I had to switch to my Moana. I am a
Mm.
Samoan. I'm not a Palangi filmmaker. I'm not coming to exploit you. I'm from my village of Nofoali'i. Can I come and speak to other fellow villages of your island so that we can share stories? So that's how I would get in. And
Mm.
then when I would get to these islands, some of them were very hard to find. Now, the Solomon Islands, for instance, Malaita is another island not far from Guaracanao. To get there, I would have needed permission from the New Zealand government because the funding that funded me and the project came from Ministry of Culture and Heritage. Their exception of where I go, exception, did I just make
Ah.
that up? It has to be based on what's approved by the
Mm.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So,
Mm.
for instance, I wanted to go to PNG, but according to the MFAT, that is a level 3, 4, or 5 danger.
Right, right.
They would
Mm.
not put a New Zealander in there, which really upset me because I used to be in Papua New Guinea. I used
Mm.
to tour Rabaul with the legend of all legends, George Tillich. And if you don't
Mm.
know who George Tillich is, I need you to Google or YouTube him. People think Fiji is the biggest Melanesian artist, Polynesian slash in the world. George Tillich to me is the biggest artist, the only Pacific Islander to ever play at the original South by Southwest in America. Now that's where most bands and artists around the world go to be discovered. And this beetle not eating short ass man from Rabaul was the first to play there with a Fa'ili and a band that's all white Australians, right? Um, he's amazing because he writes in Pidgin English, and his market is Solomon Island, Vanuatu, and all of Papua New Guinea.
Mm.
So, and then I've spent a lot of my time in Solomon Islands. I spent a lot of my youth in Vanuatu. So I know these islands. They're like my home. That's why I'm comfortable going there. But alas, we could not go. And then we could not go to Hawaii or Tahiti, Hawaii, because the same time they had the Maui fire, if you remember.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah, well, I'm like, I'm not going to Maui. I'm going to Oahu. The level of danger. I'm like, do you
Mm.
understand how far apart Oahu and So we couldn't go. We couldn't go to Tahiti or the Federated States or Micronesia. One, we always look at Tahiti as a Franco land.
Mm.
As you know, the Pacific is split between Anglo and Franco. So you and I were English speakers. We are part of the Anglo Islanders. Then the Franco, which is New Caledonia, Tahiti, and very much so Vanuatu, because Vanuatu is English and French. Because I want to include them, and arena to include Hawaii because, unfortunately, for the Franco and the Anglo, though we have our own colonizers, we're more freer than Hawaii, our
Mm.
Kanaka Maori. Because at the end of the day, there's a struggle to have their own cultural identity because they are the 50th state of the
Mm.
United States. You know, and so that's why we couldn't go to those islands. So when I did land in these places, I had to do the what they say in Maori, kanohi kita kanohi, tangata
Mm.
kita tangata. I had to go seek the villages, sit face to face, and everybody would say the same thing. Oh, we had enough. We just spoke to one white guy from Australia, one So they got tired because they ended up being extracted for their knowledge. And so when I came along, I think it was a bit of a natural disarming when they saw that I'm a colored person,
Mm.
and that before I speak to anybody, I never speak in English. I need to connect indigenously.
Mm.
So I don't, in Fiji, we sit down before we say, hey, hi, Bula. I would always say, yeah, Momono, Fatula, what you, but yeah, because it's not him I'm speaking to or her. I'm speaking to the ancestors. I need them to accept me before we switch in. Because that's who I speak to when I go to these lands. Why? These lands were once ours. Not in I own them, but we used to travel together. Remember the division of passports that came with the colonials? We never had passports. No one owned the Moana. It belonged to
Mm.
everybody. But when they came, they created economic zone of you go this way. You can't fish this far. That's Guam, right? That's how I was able to gain their trust and be entrusted with the knowledge that they gave me. And it's always with a warning. Please treat carefully the Mersina of our peoples. And
Mm.
we're trusting it to you more than anybody because you're one of us.
With everything that you know, just through these different projects that you've been doing with sounds, what's something that you learned that you didn't know while doing this project? Is there anything new, any new knowledge that you picked up that you thought, wow, how did I not even know that?
I don't, maybe that's a question I'll probably have an answer to in a few years.
Mm.
But one of the things that I did not know was the level of deterioration
Mm.
of our knowledge of when it comes to these sound producing instruments. I did not know, I was ignorantly thinking that it was only Samoa that had discarded the welcoming of our old sounds. But so you'll find in the instruments of the Moana, I actually dedicated an entire episode to the mouth pipes of Vanuatu because the other 7 episodes is one instrument and how it is manifested in different islands. So there's the nose flute, and then I
Mm.
go into the nose flute according to the Cook Islanders, the nose flute, you know what I mean? But the mouth pipes of Vanuatu, I decided to dedicate it all to Vanuatu in honor of this chap I met by the name of Edgar Hinge. And the reason being is I got to Vanuatu, and so I met him. And as we got to know each other, I said, "Oh, Edgar, you were doing this for a long time." And he said, "Yes, yes, too long. I'm ready to go home." you know, I thought it was a joke. So I said, "Hey, what do you mean you're ready to go home?" So we were in the island of Efate, but he comes from the island of Pentecost, Penama. And Edgar just so happened to be the only knowledge holder living in the whole of Vanuatu that has not the secret, but has the wealth of knowledge in making, playing, and speaking about up over 10 instruments. And for the amount of time that he's being employed by the Vanuatu Culture Center, he really wanted to retire. But they wouldn't let him until he has successfully trained somebody to
Mm,
take over his place. Now, here's the tricky part, Rosa. These instruments, even the youth of Vanuatu had taken on to the phone, the
mm,
reggae piano, and all of that. He is struggling to even teach his own kids the value of these instruments. So when I turned up and I said, I want to film you, talk about these instruments, so that one day when you're no longer here, when you have transitioned from the physical Edgar to the ancestral Edgar, um, you know, your the Vanuatu people can continue making. The light bulb went off in Edgar's head, and we couldn't stop. We couldn't stop him talking. We went through 10 instruments, right? Story, how to make it. That was 2 days worth of, nearly 3 days worth of filming. So that episode is only 9 minutes. It could
mm,
only fit 4 instruments. Um, but I'll remember that because sadly, if nobody from Vanuatu is to follow Edgar's reign, if Edgar ever exits into the spiritual realm, there goes the last knowledge holder of all his amazing sound instruments. Now that's what I didn't know before. I thought it was just particularly Samoa,
mm,
because we Samoa as an island nation, we actually one of the main Christianized country that was then used by the missionaries to spread Christianity to the Solomon Island, coastal Papua New Guinea, as well as Vanuatu. So I've always thought because when we took on Christianity, something always has to give. You can't have, we say in Samoa, va'alua, you can't, the
mm,
Bible itself says you can't serve two masters at one time, right? So Samoa took that literally and all. But when I got there, it was the same. Then it became the theme. Got to Fiji, same. Actually,
mm.
Fiji was a bit sad story for me because we got to Fiji and the last nose flute player passed away 2 years before I landed.
Ah,
And nobody knew he has passed, not even the ministry that used to look after him. They only
wow.
found out when I went to the village. So, but in terms of discoveries for me, it's that those are important discoveries. Yeah, because this project is all about reviving, maintaining, preserving. And so we found that the common factor in all of the knowledge holders that trusted their stories on me is that they were nearly and almost the last of its kind for their islands and communities.
Mm. I mean, for each of them or each of those islands, are there conversations about preserving that part of their identity or that part of their culture, or is it really just, I mean, did you see any of that or did you hear talk of that? Like, how do you preserve if, like you said, the youth they're not interested, they're
Everybody wants technology, you know. Even the furthest island of Solomon Islands, for instance, everybody wants to. A young person's a young person. It's the same anywhere. It wants
mm,
opportunities. It wants the latest technology. It wants access to what they see on TV. And so you'll find that a lot of these communities, it's a bit of an uphill battle when you try to teach them tradition, right? So it was the same. Um, but some islands, part of its benefit is its isolation.
mm,
So it becomes a benefit when you're looking at um, there's no option for you to get on a boat and run out to another island, right? So and then it also becomes part of the culture. How are you cultivating these youth so that they
mm,
um, remain active and happy about your
mm,
traditional things? And so for Vanuatu alone, like I'm saying, when you watch the episode, Edgar is totally talking about I'm doing this here, but I don't
mm,
know who's coming behind me. That ain't a
mm,
lie, right? That ain't a lie because at the moment, um, he gets flown around the world. to represent Vanuatu in all these festivals, because he also does sand drawing, sand art,
Mm.
which is uniquely Vanuatu was once one. I'm sure it was Pacific, but at some point, and Vanuatu has a strong relationship to sand drawing. To my knowledge, he's the only guy. Maybe there are other people, but to the level that Edgar does, and remember, these levels you don't get to overnight.
Mm.
And so he gets flown around the world to do all of these things. But when he comes home, no one knows that Edgar just finished playing in Mexico. That he just finished playing at the Eiffel Tower, right?
He's
Because he
just your
comes,
uncle down the road who's just the
yeah,
average guy.
yeah, because he comes home, transitions into his traditional clothing, and just walks
Mm.
from his house to work. So here I am, boy, man, this dude is like, but but what is like, oh yeah, that's Edgar. He's from Panama. He's usually like that, just wearing no clothes, just his traditional wear, and going to work and back. So you know,
As I hear you talk about Edgar, and he's been flown around the world, and he's given talks and shared this knowledge. I'm just thinking about all the people around the world who have seen this before us. Like, if not for this podcast, like how many of our other knowledge holders from the other Pacific Islands have been flown around the world, and people have seen it, like in Europe or wherever. And here we are, 9 minutes of a podcast with just this wealth of knowledge, and that's not even the full story. Like,
eh.
oh,
Well, look, the reality is this: my podcast. So people say, "Oh, see, why did you do it?" I was a, I've always, my wife and I have a what we call 100-year plan. About 8 years ago, we decided, it was one of those thinking because no parent wants the worst for their kids. When you become a parent, you just want the best. But we also didn't want to do the best to the point where people parent their kids based on what they didn't have. That's not reality. You're giving them a piece of a reality they never knew existed, right? So, what's the best way that we could do for our kids is to create almost like platforms where they can use to become whatever the hanky panky is the coolest thing by the time they come into their own time to walk the earth. And so we decided on a 100-year plan. It could have been 200, but you know what? I see 100 better than I can 200, unless I
yeah, you're
find the
not
fridge.
Abraham, man. Calm down.
Yeah, yeah. Unless I find the fridge that Mel Gibson slept in Forever Young, right? That dude went in, and then nearly 100 years later, he came back out. So if I find that fridge, I'm seeing my plan alive. But we wanted to put a number so that we can plan towards. And then my wife and I decided to accept the theory that unless we are prepared to accept the fact that 99% of everything we're building now, we will never get to see its fruits. We will be building recklessly because we will be building. I have to taste it. I have to taste it. No, that can't be. That's just giving you stress. So then the 100-year plan came to okay, so what are some of the things I want to leave the kids? People say, oh man, you can leave them land. Yeah, okay, cool. But we are migratory people. That's why you and I, when I ask you, where are your villages, Rosa? You can only start with two. Because 100 years ago, it's not where you end up now.
Hmm.
And 100 years from today, whatever land I leave my kids, somebody else will be living there. So, so I thought to myself, what can I leave them? And I thought, okay, so when we left our home islands to come to Aotearoa, we couldn't bring all of our culture. So how did we maintain it? Well, we brought songs, we brought stories, we brought music, we brought sounds. So what am I leaving for my babies? I'm leaving them stories. I'm leaving them sounds. Because in those sounds lies the identity markers of who they will be. And also, my babies are going to marry non-Samoan, non-Pacific. And if I were to compound that 100 years from today, culture might Samoa might look different. Lea Whakatonga will look different. But one thing is consistent. You look at The Rock. That man is Samoan, African Canadian, but he grew up in the Sounds. This is why you see him and his mom dancing only to Samoan songs in his videos. That's the reality for most of our kids. So what can I build to make sure my kids will always what we say in Samoa? Lale mamau sa pipi ileama. Wherever you go, you jump into the ocean, you get a little lost, put your hand on the oar. Stories, sounds. One day there will be a human colony of Samoans, Tongans, and everyone else on the moon. And guess what they'll take with them? The same thing we brought with us here: stories, songs, sounds. The Rock have no idea what the hell Punyalava and Fetulima are singing. Neither do they know Lisa Lanialo's song. But because mom listens to it, but because it's part of his identity, you watch the movie Young Rock, it's all of 5 stars. Why is it
Mm,
important to him? Because memories of songs, dance, and language. So that's why the podcast is a labor of love from me to my babies and to
mm,
every parent and their babies. If you are thinking futuristically, what can you leave behind that? Because this conversation, like this podcast you and I are having, kids are gonna watch it 100 years from today, 100 plus. This because we now live in the digital realm, so we have to be responsible for what we leave behind now. And I say 100-year plan because our current generation, we are engaged trying to figure out how to live in this world. Our past generation, parents one, their cup is already full. I can only think it and focus on the incoming. So if this is going to be part of what they will learn at school, great. Better than what you and I learned at school. The history of Henry VIII is, huh? Where's he from? Safakulafai? No? Why the hell did I spend my time learning about him? This is why you and I know more about Macbeth than we do about our own people. It's a propaganda proposition, right? This is how you continue to expand colonialism. And you and I can quote Princess Leia or King Leia, or we can quote, Mandela. Okay. So, can you quote me Mataafa Yosefo?
mm. I'm speechless. I'm really inspired right now. You have no idea. I am quite moved by what you have shared. I want to, as you're sharing, Mahi Moana Inc. Can you share a little bit about that work, because I know that what you do is part of the advocacy that Mahi Moana does. So are you able to share a little bit about it? I
Yep.
feel like you guys do this amazing work in our communities and abroad, but we just don't hear enough about Mahi Moana.
So Mahimana was founded by myself and three other people. So it was me, Nefiongoyati Malu no Masio, Tony Fuemana. So if you are familiar with the last name, Tony Fuemana comes from the Fuemana family, which brought us OMC. How bizarre. It also brought us Phil Fuemana, who started the first Pacific hip hop label, which is called Urban Pacifica. That started the career of people that came to Dawn Raids and all of that, right? So that line. And then Samoan sister by the name of Celine Uber. And the reason why we came together to register Mahimoana is because we're all musicians and we've identified that our people are amazing when it comes to the natural gift of the talent. Just like entertainment, just like sports. I mean, you give any of our youth a ball. Now we're becoming good at soccer, but back then it was just the oval ball.
Mm.
Um, and plus, the soccer, you need to have the money to have the gears. Whereas the rugby ball, just even if you don't have boots, just run. And so we decided to focus in how can we support first our musicians because we were musos. But as we formed Mahimana, we realized this is a challenge that's also faced by other creatives like actors, copywriters, visual artists. And so Mahimana therefore existed to be an advocacy for things like copywriting your works or registering your music, or if you need some funding to continue a project, we're not going to give you any money, but we'll help you go look for one. And then we also focused in on artist disputes. So because a lot of our artists were so great at music, but a lot of us ended up self-harming because of the pride that we're not going to tell anybody we're losing money. We're also not going to tell anyone that we just got ripped off by people, because people are going to look at us and laugh because we're all about the hood. We had to remind them, hey, great, but you're also a father. So your pride is starving your kids from having some income, right? So it's about, and then we would go and find lawyers. We would go find accountants. We would go find lawyers. Because why is that? Have you ever heard of any Palangi artist in New Zealand that suffers the deals of pain that we do? No.
Mm.
You look at OMC, great OMC. The brother didn't, when he passed away, there were still a lot of debts owed to the labels. I mean, who does that, right? And this is not saying that this is anybody's fault, but this is the industry we currently inherited. So we wanted to produce and provide, because most Palangis, oh, dad has a friend who's a lawyer. Mom is the secretary of or a legal advisor. Who do we know? Factory workers, supervisors, coach of the rugby team. Our natural surrounding didn't have the roles that is required to support our creation. And look at the Super Rugby. We are the greatest names when it comes to rugby and rugby league and contact sport. None of us owns a franchise. We are the commodity to be traded and make money off. But none of us has the power to be able to own a team. Oh, I'm on a Pacific. Yeah, great, but that's invest my money. And not all of them are Pacific investors, right? And we depend on the, please, master, you ever live better dollar, you spend it my way, I just might make it. Mahimwana existed to serve and accompany our creatives who are stuck somewhere along the line. If it's to do with marketing, give us a call. We don't have a lot of money, but I'll tell you what, we know somebody, and then we'll go and argue on your behalf. So this instruments at the Moana, this everyone that we gathered for the Sounds podcast, they became our Pacific Ainga. So they became the networks and the net worth of Mahimwana. And they then blessed Mahimwana with the knowledge to then be the cultural partner to the instruments of the Moana. We had to make sure that everything that the organization was doing is culturally sound, not just promise us and then not just milk our culture and then, what's the saying? A lot of these Palangi organizations bring us on board as token, uh, yeah, tokenistic approach, and then they'll only take the fruits and forget about the roots. So that was Mahimwana's role in this particular project.
How can people get in touch with Mahimwana artists, or how can they get in touch through the I think a website is in development, but would it be through Instagram? Would that be the easiest way to kind of reach out and get connected? Or
yeah, look, our website, it was finished building 2 years ago, but at the moment the operation is always just between two of us, myself and Tiumalu. Our other two members, they've got their own commitments with their own jobs. So Tiumalu and I are the ones that dedicate full time with the support of the others. So at the moment, the best way to get in touch with us is through our Instagram, which is Mahimwana Inc., or our Facebook, same name, or just email myself, which is alpha.maiava@mahimwana.com. If you are wanting to know more about how to register your songs, or if you are a creative artist, what is it that you're needing? Is it to look at royalties of your work if it's being displayed at a museum or something like that, or and get in touch with us. We are 100% voluntary. We are very lucky to have been supported by the Ministry of Pacific Peoples, also by the Auckland Unlimited, and we're currently trying to, work with Foundation North. These are all organizations in New Zealand, but we are still here today because we have some amazing volunteers and mentors. We can't afford to pay them, but they saw the need that This is what's missing from our Pacific people. That it's not right that we are amazing singers and actors and, you know, um, just performing in general, but we are lacking the support so that the arts of creation is supported by the business of the arts.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you are watching on YouTube, if you are listening through the streaming podcast platforms, check the bio. We will have the Mahi Moana contacts in there, social media links. We will have the links to the podcast, Sounds of the Moana. We will have links there for the Instruments of the Moana project. Get amongst it, fam. You know, there's just so much of our Indigenous knowledge that we don't know, and this is a start. Like if we don't know, we just don't know. But here is something uh, visually, and you can just listen through a podcast. Just get amongst it and check it out if you haven't. Our young people. I mean, this has all been like advertised, the podcast as well as the docu-series. It's online. You see it through Instagram, but if you can get on YouTube and check it out, it's not to be missed. Like it's such important, necessary education, especially for those of us in the diaspora who have born and bred in the diaspora. Like, what an amazing opportunity to check it out. So if you're listening, if you're watching, check the bio. Do that. I want to run off our podcast, but I also know that I want to mention this because you are also a father, you have your family, and I want to mention to Farmer Mao Collective. Your family is a key supporter of this collective, and how can people support or connect or find out more information? Uh, this is something that's very important to you and your family. Tau'ili'ili.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Rosa. So, just a quick background. So, Farmer Mao Collective was actually founded by a very driven chap by the name of Lefionga Atunumafono Abafamoe. Abafamoe is low vision without sight. I wasn't born that way. He acquired it later on in life. So, before that, he was a blooming flower. But Joe Farmer Mao was started as an advocacy, same thing that Mahi Moana is for musicians. That currently is the only Pacific disabled collective, and we Tuna Mafono founded the organization so that we could challenge a few things. So, for instance, the word disability. Yeah,
Mm,
the meaning of the word is disability, no ability, or one lack of. We don't have that word in our culture. Um, because mainly, if you look at our own history, people with disability, what we've called them now is Tagata Moana. So instead of saying, "Oh, that one has a disability off," we're saying, "Well, that Tagata Moana lives with cerebral palsy." That Tagata Moana, and Tagata Moana, Tagata is very a general word for all of our Pacific Islanders. Tangata Kanaka, which means a group of people or a person. And Sa'ili Malo comes from two words. Sa'ili in Samoa means search or to seek, and Malo means winning or the kingdom. So when you put them together, is people, person, or persons in pursuit of greatness,
mm,
in pursuit of success, whatever that may be. Look at how general that term is, because a lot of us that are actually able-bodied have
mm,
very Tagata Sa'ili Malo mentality.
mm,
But we've always looked at disabled people based on the physical body. But what we have known, Stephen Hawkins,
mm,
the greatest tangata sa Ilimalo mind, right? One of these. So that's why, first and foremost, we needed to change the terminology. Why is
mm.
that important? Because you become what they call you, which is why brings me to another point. Be careful what you name your kids. Rambo is cool when they're kids. When they grow up, go for a job interview, Rambo is just sounds rebellious. Eh, I'm digressing, but so that's what Farmer Mao started. But I guess our kind of claim to fame, if there is such a thing within this conversation, is we were the ones that petitioned the government of New Zealand in 2020 for a ministry for disabled peoples. So that was granted on the 28th of October 2021. And it wasn't that it was advocated by a Pacific collective. We were just the latest one to continue the advocacy that was started by other Tangata Sa'ili Malo of all races of Aotearoa much earlier on. So that's Tofama Mao. We exist to advocate and lobby certain industries and certain sectors for what's required for our Tangata Sa'ili Malo. So, for instance, at the moment, we have the model of care. We feel that the model of care that currently exists in New Zealand is very individualistic. When you apply for the funding, it benefits only the person that's impacted, yeah? But in our communities, everybody's a carer.
Mm.
And there's no time off. The carer finishes at 5, goes home. Then who takes over? Mom, sibling, father, yeah? How are they looked after? Oh, sorry, but that's not part of the care model.
Mm.
So we're pushing forward for a collective, which means if you are providing a grant for the benefit of the impacted person, also make some allowance to how providing that service is impacting other members of the family who have to look after him or her. So it's a collective, whereas the current New Zealand system is quite individualistic, which doesn't fit our people. This is why we struggle to apply for fundings to be able to deal to our unique experience with Tagata Sa'ili Malo. And so if anybody wants to know, it's tofamamau.com. You can go up there and you'll probably see the first kid there with sunglasses on his pouch. It's my son. And that's why we ended up, because that's my son's world. That's now our world. That's his community. Anybody with a Tangata Sa'ili Malo condition, and what's good for Tagata Sa'ili Malo is also good for the elderlies. For instance, my son has a condition whereby it deteriorates. So the older he gets, the lesser he's able to fully use his limbs. So the way we care for him is pretty much the same way we care for our elderlies, because he struggles in the cold. All right. And I know our elderlies, the older they become because we move less, they also limit in terms of their mobility. So what does that look like? Bathrooms. Make sure you've got good wet rooms that are big enough to fit the
Mm.
wheelchair and to fit the person impacted and you, the carer. So you start to look at the doors of houses. Let's start looking at wider doors, wider corridors, and let's start looking into pocket doors instead of one where you need the hand to turn. Because what if the person can't turn? And the older
Mm.
you get, you have arthritis, same challenge. So what's good for Tangata Sa'ili Malo is also good for our elderly. We're looking at challenging building codes because in New Zealand now, a lot of the houses are not made for our people.
Mm.
The government is building 3-story houses and where all the bedrooms are upstairs. What if my grandmother has got a hip problem? She got to crawl 3 stories to sleep?
Mm.
So a lot of that stuff is what we do with Tofa Mama.
Mm. Earlier on in the podcast, you were talking about you were someone who loved learning about cultures. And when you think about you at that age, as a young adult, what would Alpha, the young adult, say to you, Tau'ili'ili Alpha Maiava, right now, 2024? Like, do you think that, did you see yourself doing, I don't know, traveling the world and doing all of that and just being such a huge advocate for our communities? Do you think that Alpha back then will be very proud of you? Did you take the path that you intended to? Yeah.
Look, let's be honest. The alpha that grew up in Nofali probably did a lot of mind traveling, but
Mm.
never thought. Uh, one of the things that I learned early is I got to know me very early. I learned about myself really early in terms of what I'd like to happen, how it happens. So I will not be telling you absolutely lies if I say I always knew then I would go somewhere, but I didn't know how.
Mm.
I didn't know when it was going to happen. And this is because, like I said, I grew up with a father that was quite a big mover, and we were village people, right? So my mind then was, if my dad could do that from Savai, I grew up in Nofali, which is closer to the airport. I'm sure I can leave faster and a little bit better than he, right? But not to the extent of where I end up and what I've accumulated. So if I were to have a conversation with myself, then you got to understand, when you're a kid in the 80s in Samoa and the late 70s going into the 80s, um, it was the age of massive family reunions every Christmas. Every family's, you know what I mean? And our village used to look forward to it, because back then you will end up having boys and girls of a little bit fairer skin. And a lot of us would go do their fi'aus instead of doing the fi'au at your home, just in the hope of catching a chocolate, a lolly, or you just might hold the New Zealand girl's hand. Um, so it was, we were dreaming of leaving because we want to come back and be treated nicely like those guys. When they come back and do no fi'au, they probably lived in a state house in Auckland, but when they came to Nufali, Oka, they were royalties. We would have given them a title just like Charles. So I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape my island. That's why at 15 years old, when I got the scholarship to come here, I'm like, latest, I am never coming back here. This land suppresses children's dreams. But now I want to do nothing but go home. So to the young alpha that was trying to be, I try to pretend to be a lot of people. I try to practice my English really early. We had an NTSC. For those of you that probably don't even know what a video cassette player is, NTSC was the American model of a video player. And so you either have the New Zealand version or you have the NTSC. And my dad bought one, and it came with one movie. It was Iron Eagle. That movie was the only movie we had in Samoa in our house for 5 years. And I would watch it every day after school. And kind of why I ended up with an American twang, because I thought anybody who spoke English must sound like the white dude on the movie. It wasn't until my cousins used to come from New Zealand or Australia for family visits. I'm casually trying to show off my English. Hey, what up, man? What do you guys feel like drinking today? Like, you want to go to the market and everything? And then would look at us and go, pretend that. And I'm like, what? Why? Where is your accent from? Like, what's an accent? So that was the alpha back then. I was just trying to learn anything to get off the island. Because I wasn't creative as young, but I couldn't get away. So, I would tell that guy, just continue on with your fake ass American accent. I needed something to latch on, but it's okay. Just learn English that way, and then you'll figure out how to latch onto everything else as you go. But you'll turn out all right. The universe is going to bless you with 3 beautiful children. And you're going to have to then learn how to leave behind some little crumbs for those babies to take on when it's time for them to be in decision-making aspects of their lives. But continue sounding like you're from California or Milwaukee. Or
I actually thought you were from the state. I was like, oh, what? Is Jewish background?
Now, I mean, everybody know about that now. But it was funny too, and I came here and people were like, hey, you from Hawaii? I'm like, no, I'm from Samoa. And then you would go to Hawaii, because I used to visit my auntie and uncle, and they used to say, wow, your Kiwi accent is so beautiful. Do you know how confusing that is? Right? Confusing to the fact that I grew up in Samoa. I don't know what an accent is. And yet people tell you that you sound like something every time you go to a different place. And then while I was studying in Korea, I had to, my fake Americanism had to kick up a level, because that's the only way the Koreans would understand English.
Yeah.
Right? You know what they tell you over there? My name is Kwangju, but my American name is, I'm like, what? You say my English name is, but okay. Yeah, my American name is. I'm like, man, I don't know. Just when I thought I knew everything. Yeah, keep faking it, Lefa, of young age. Keep living in your head, because it was the living in my head that it ended up in me writing the script for Instruments of the Moana.
Man, if you're listening, if you're watching, today we have really only touched upon, the sounds, the instruments of the Moana. We have touched upon Mahi Moana. We haven't even scraped the surface with this film star over here. Former music artist, won awards. I mean, guys, that is a whole nother podcast. Do you all realize who this is? Do you know who Tau'ili'ili Alpha Maiava is? Go and Google. You will find out. He is a man of many skills and talents. I ask all my guests self care before we wrap up. How do you take care of yourself? Everyone always struggles when they come on the show and they ask. I ask this question, like, how do you look after your health and well being so you can be there for your family 100%?
I'm very blessed. I'm very blessed that I married not just my equal, but someone who is the leader of what I do. My wife is all about self care, and I think the self care, and you know how things happen for a reason, right? I don't think I would have cared so much about having a of how I grow young if I didn't have my son. Because my son, we have to lift him when he requires. We have to do a lot of stuff for him to dress him, brush his teeth, and whatnot. And he is coming up to about just under 5 feet tall at the moment, and he's only 11. Yeah. So my wife and I work out 6 days a week, every morning at 6 a.m. I'm not going after a world record of having abs on top of abs. My 6 a.m. is so I can stay mobile. Because until we come across groups of people who are able to comfortably lift up my son, take him to the bathroom late at night, and all of that good stuff, for the meantime, it's mommy, daddy, and our two daughters. So I've got no option but to look after myself. Part of my challenge is because it's just a challenge with no excuse. I love my food. So I work out and I'm trying to avoid rewarding my workouts. But that's part of the kryptonite I'm trying to overcome. I'm very, I have no quarrels cutting people out of my life, even family members. And I have to be comfortable with the saying, um, relatives is who you share blood with and ended up being born in the same house. Family is how and who you make an environment with. I have best friends that I trust more with my children than I do my own blood. Nobody's fault. I'm saying this because a lot of us are tied to the guilt of, oh, it's family. I got to go with family. Remember, family is also part of where harm comes from. So I don't stay loyal to the word relation. I stay loyal to the word family. And the family that I have, my wife and I, is made up of some who I share blood with and also those who we share the ideology of how to go through life together with. And then you have to be really 100% committed to making sure you don't go astray from it. Because we're humans, we feel for things. Yeah. But yeah, self care for us is number one. My wife is a very active person, so sometimes I go along just so I could stalk her while she's working out, and while I'm doing that, I'm on a treadmill just watching my wife. Right? That's actually not a joke. That's a reality. Everyone in the gym that we go to, like, here comes the couple where the woman works out and the husband is just intent to stalk his wife. I'm like, yeah, that's why we got married because I want to stalk this woman for life. Uh, you know, but yeah, learning culture is part of my self care. And identity is an important thing. Here's the thing: we can speak amazing English, better English than our cousins who grew up in the islands. But when a Palangi looks at you, you're not a Palangi. You are someone of color who can speak English. So there's a poem by Tatasimi, right? I don't know if you heard of the poem called Identity, where a lot of the poem is um, learn things Palangi, not so you may become Palangi, but so you may understand the essence of being Samoan.
Mm.
Yeah. And the whole thing about that poem is learn this, learn that, to avoid yourself the shame of one day asking, who am I? Because remember,
Mm.
the physical care is only a portion. The majority is the mental and the spiritual care. I'm not talking about religiosity. Those are two different things. Spirituality is the realm that you use to keep your wairu tuning as you are trying to achieve something in the physical. So you are talking to someone who I live in a house that I have no choice but to sign up for the self care. Because who's gonna lift my son? How can I lift him if I've got a bad back?
Mm.
How can I keep him longer because my son can't exercise, right? So how do I make sure that he doesn't inherit any of the ABCD that daddy has, like the high blood pressure, the diabetes, the because it doesn't move. So we have to focus on his food because it doesn't burn. So how do we keep him live longer? So self care, that's massive in my house, and also because we don't know what whether what we're doing is right. Because you know what happens to this conversation? One day, this conversation is going to live in you and I's hindsight. Yeah. So, according to the hindsight of where we just came from, what we're doing now is the best solution to be able to overcome what we went through then. And this conversation, it's about to enter the archives of when we look back from 100 years from today. So, the best that we can do is continue building based on what we know. Don't try to go ahead of yourself. That's how you stress yourself out and ended up rewarding without even doing the work. And I'm a lifetime student of learning.
Mm.
A lot of things I know now, I will probably talk against it 5 years from today or even tomorrow. But instead of apologizing for my mistakes, I'll just tell people I made a decision out of what I knew then. Just like my ancestors made their decision to either go left or right based on the information they had at the time. That's self care. Is don't live with guilt. Don't be shadowed by the what if. I always tell people it's always good to meet yourself in the future and you are guided by just for now instead of if only. Because right now, I want to be the greatest lawyer. But if I were to meet me in 5 years and I was like, Sonny, what happened? Why are you washing cars? See, I'm washing cars right now just for now, but I'm still going to be a lawyer. I don't want
Mm.
to meet me in 5 years where I talk about the at least. Silly, what happened? I thought you were going to be a lawyer. Yeah, man, but decided to wash cars because at least it pays the bills.
Mm. Oh, so much knowledge shared today. I've been sitting here with my pen, listening to in my notebook, scribbling, hoping that what I'm writing is legible later when I look at it. Um, as we wrap up our podcast, Tau'ili'ili, Tau'ili'ili, amazing. You have no idea when you reached out a few days ago to check out the docu-series. It was my opportunity to finally ask you. I have been you've been on my wish list for the podcast since I started in April 2021, but I was just trying to build up the courage for 3 years. And when you reached out, I was like, oh, I think this is my opportunity. So it just means it's such an honor. It is such an honor to have you here. Like I just feel like, oh yeah, who am I to be sitting here and just hearing you share this knowledge? Like it's just been amazing. Like these podcasts, I always walk away with just so much more knowledge than when I started. It doesn't matter who has come on the show. Every time there's always a takeaway, always lessons learned, and same thing with you today. I just want to wish you and your family all the best, as we finish off 2024. I'm sending lots of love to your wife and the kids. But yeah, just keep doing what you do. You are just we need more people like you out there just sharing this indigenous knowledge that the Palangi people are out there doing. We don't need them doing that. We need people that look like us, that sound like us out there doing that work. And I just hope that more people can access these archives that you talk about that is now online. I hope that one day you will think about writing a book. And I know we've talked about, books are not really, people don't really read books, they're listening to audiobooks. Well, put out an audiobook. I'm sure many people would love to hear your voice and to hear that knowledge that you have to share. So I'm just wishing you all the best just for the future. I'm looking forward to seeing what other projects um, you are involved in, and yeah, that's it from me. I'm just feeling overwhelmed. So much knowledge in me right now. I need to go and process after. But I always ask guests just to finish off the show with a, a quote or something or final word of encouragement. Yeah, just to wrap us up.
Mhm. Well, look, just want to say thank you, Rosa, for the opportunity, and it's thank you for sharing what you just did. And I always tell people, make sure you understand this. What I'm telling you doesn't belong to me. I'm just as privileged as you are. These are the knowledge entrusted unto me. So who am I to keep it to myself? If my life got better because somebody sat down one day and shared something with me, the rule of the world is once you have accumulated all of this and you have reached a place whereby the knowledge can now do something better for someone else, pass it on. So, as much as you're saying that what I know is needed, your platform is needed too. This is all part of us being on the va'a. Everybody's got their own part to play, but we're paddling towards the same direction. So thank you for the initiative that you've taken to have this podcast. On the flip side, I've been waiting to be on your podcast, right? And that's the thing. Um, one of the greatest things that I've learned in life is humility. The difference between humility and false humility. And sometimes we, as Pacific Islanders, we're always told to be humble. Seems to be the topic of the day lately. But you always get told that don't speak unless you're spoken to, be humble at all times, and then we look at that as humility. As a matter of fact, I had to learn to share with my Tagata Moana the form of humility that we should take on. True humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. Thinking of yourself less is if I've got $5 and I know that a friend of mine will probably do a little bit more if I were to share $2 from that $3. I am keeping, but I'm also sharing. Thinking less of myself is when I think, oh, someone else is better than me. I can never do what he or she does. That's false humility. The humility that is currently spreading like a plague over our youth. That's why we have identity problems. I hate the word plastic tongue and plastic Samoa.
Mm,
They are excuses for you to learn your language. See, these are terminologies. Why do I say that? Because there are more onga mata in New Zealand than there are in Samoa. You have better chance to learn Samoan
mm,
in New Zealand than in Samoa. Why? Samoans don't care about teaching Samoans because you grow up in Samoa.
mm,
So if you are in your journey, remember, and they're all free schools. You can just log into one, start your journey. So thank you again for having me on. I do apologize if there was something I shared that did not sit right with some of your audience. I'm just sharing you my experience. I'd love to hear about yours one day. And if you got the opportunity to write a book or make a film, do it. Because these blessings aren't particular to our person or our group of people. We all have the same power to access. You just got to tap in to the source. My source has always been my culture. I could not tell these stories if I were from Italy. It would sound weird, wouldn't it? But because I'm from the Moana, I'm a son and daughter of this house. Of course, it's my birthright to be able to share what I know. Um, quote, funniest thing is I've got it right here in front of me. Show me your friends and I'll tell you your future.
And I guess it's a wrap.